My name is Alex. I am a graduate of philosophy and theology, and I'm a YouTuber. I wonder, it'd be quite interesting just to get a feel of the room, actually. How many people here are Christians? Is that the time upon an honest analysis of the world we find ourselves in, it should compel us to dismiss the hypothesis of a supernatural creator?
Okay, so before we get to that passage here, really I want to go through this and give my rebuttal for Alex's "this is why I don't believe in God," his reasons for not believing in God. And before I do this, I just want to say that I've been just exposed to him this year and I've been watching his content. And I actually like the guy. I think he's a nice guy. I think if one day we sat in a room, I think I would get along with him. Seems reasonable, seems incredibly intelligent, and I just want to present the case for God here because he does raise some challenging questions. Does God hide himself? Why is belief unevenly distributed around the world? And what about suffering, particularly suffering of animals? And what is the purpose of that? These are all pretty weighty questions, and my hope is that by the end of this video, you'll discover fresh insights, not only addressing these issues, but also that it draws you closer to a personal understanding and relationship with Jesus Christ. And so let's tackle these points. I'm going to break it down point by point. And I don't think faith needs to be blind or boring. I think it can be joyful. I think it can be engaging. And yes, occasionally witty, which Alex is very witty. So yeah, let's break down his reasons one by one and attempt to refute them so that perhaps in your personal walk, if you run into someone with these same arguments, you'll also be able to have an answer.
It reads, "Where can I go from your presence? Or where can I flee from your spirit? If I ascend to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths of the Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall guide me, and your right hand shall hold me fast." This poem in its entirety is given by the NRSV a title, "The Inescapable God." It's a message of bold reassurance to the believer, reminding them that since God is present everywhere, pervading every inch of our universe, he is, in the happiest sense possible, inescapable. But my first argument, and it's going to be the first of three, against the viability of theism, flows from the demonstrable fact that this divine consolation is seemingly not offered universally, and often in fact restricted from those who want it the most. I'm going to be making the claim specifically that atheism or naturalism provides a better account for three facts of our universe. The first being the hiddenness of God. The second being the geographical, statistical arrangement, shall we say, of religious belief. And the third will be the problem of gratuitous suffering, and we'll see if we get time to finish it off. This strange phenomenon is known as the problem of divine hiddenness. If there is a God, then simply, why is he hidden from so many of us so much of the time? If theism is to offer a sufficient account of reality, then it must offer an account of what J.L. Schellenberg has famously labelled non-resistant non-belief, which he distinguishes from resistant non-belief. It's sometimes said by a theist who wishes to explain the problem of divine hiddenness that people simply disbelieve through their own fault. They're too stubborn. They're purposefully blinding themselves to the evidence because they don't want it to be true. They're not approaching the arguments honestly with an open heart, and that if they would only do this, then God would surely reveal himself. Such a person would be what Schellenberg calls a resistant non-believer. He'd, in some sense, because he actively resists it. For what it's worth, I do think that such people exist. I think many such people exist. There are people who come to this debate with their minds already made up. There are people who want it not to be true, that God exists, and in fact wouldn't submit to that truth even if it were true. There was a recent poll run by the Atheist Experience YouTube channel, which I know, Jonathan, you're a fan of, which asked, if there was a God, would you worship it? To which an astonishing 85% of respondents said that they would not, to be convinced of God's existence, and would jump at the chance of entering into a relationship with him if they thought that he did. But no matter how hard they search, they simply find no answer forthcoming from the heavens. And this is the non-resistant non-believer.
So I want to just go at that premise, the non-resistant non-believer. One way to combat this argument, because right on the onset here, Alex obviously introduces himself as a philosopher, as somewhat a theologian. He graduated at least in philosophy and theology, and he really sets the stage here, right? Studied philosophy, studied even theology, and he claims to be a non-resistant non-believer. Now, some would say that's actually an oxymoron. Some would say that actually doesn't exist. And biblically, we could turn to James, who says that When we draw closer to God, God draws closer to us. And so this argument strikes at that issue, this tension between wanting to find God and feeling like God can't be found. And so there's divine hunger, but also there's divine hiddenness. And Christians would say that if you have enough divine hunger, there will be no divine hiddenness. So there must be something there that is keeping you truly from God. And he just proved it in that statistic. 85% voted, even if I could be convinced, I would still not believe in God. I don't want to be convinced. Now, as a former atheist, agnostic, pantheist, and polytheist, there were times also when I had all these intellectual barriers about God. And this is my experience. The truth is, it wasn't about the intellectual barriers. It was because I was living a life of sin. I wanted to continue sleeping around. I wanted to continue drinking. I wanted to continue doing drugs. And it wasn't really about God. It was more about me. God was revealing himself to me, but I wasn't drawing closer to him. I didn't have enough divine hunger. And so if Christianity claims that God is near all of us, that he's our loving creator who supposedly knocks at the door of our hearts. And Alex is suggesting here that people are out there knocking on heaven's door, but they're hearing radio silence. So the question is, if God truly wants us to know him, why does he remain hidden for so many people who are earnestly seeking him? I love that quote of Augustine. You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. Notice the longing here. He doesn't say our hearts are bored or our hearts are indifferent, but our hearts are restless. There's a hunger, a divine hunger for something beyond ourselves. Now, if we want to make ourselves to be that God, then really our hunger is for ourselves. Our hunger is to claim divinity, and that's just like the first sin. You will be like gods. That's where Adam and Eve both fell. And it wasn't a lack of knowledge. In fact, think about this. Have you ever tried to call a friend who never picks up? We all have friends like that. You text them, they ghost you. You call them, they don't pick up. And so, okay, you leave a voicemail or you send multiple text messages, and maybe it's you're longing to share good news, or you want to ask for help, or you want to ask them out and hang out. And if they never respond, you might think they're ignoring you. But what if in this instance, their phone was silent? Or what if in this instance, they were taking a shower? Or what if in this instance, they lost their phone? Or maybe the coverage was bad and it wasn't coming in clearly. And oftentimes with our relationship with God, we often assume if we don't see an immediate answer, if we don't hear from God immediately, he must be ignoring us. And could it be possible we're not noticing the ways he's trying to get our attention? Maybe Alex isn't noticing the multiple ways God is trying to get his attention, but maybe there's something there that's blocking him from the full revelation of God. In fact, the Bible tells us that God has revealed himself in creation, in the stars. And maybe that's why here he doesn't want to talk about the beauty of the earth or microscopic organisms that prove a designer, or the brain that proves a coder, or fine-tuning that proves an intelligent being, or Jesus Christ, who came from heaven to earth to reveal himself to us. Now, if you think about Jesus, and as Christians, we believe in him, imagine he walked on this earth and people still denied him. Now, they would also say, well, God, you just didn't reveal yourself to us. Imagine the Jews who are still waiting for their Messiah. They would say also that, oh, well, he didn't reveal himself clearly enough to us, even though they couldn't find his body in the tomb, in the empty tomb. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Even nature is said to testify to his existence. And when you study science, you can actually see tidbits of God's genius. When you look at a sunset, you can see tidbits of God's artistry. When you see a baby child smile at you, you see a tidbit of God's love. And when someone shows you mercy and grace when you don't deserve it, you see a tidbit of what Jesus brought into this world. You see, God's hiddenness is often tied not to a desire to remain distant, but to humanity's own heart condition and spiritual readiness. We sometimes can expect God to show up on our terms, forgetting that the creator of the universe will show up on his terms. And he did 2,000 years ago. And he continues to do so. You know, I can't explain to you how a friend and pastor with stage 4 cancer got healed, and the doctors can't explain it either. I can't explain to you how Someone with neuroendocrine cancer got healed, and the doctors had no explanation for it, other than they were prayed over and God healed them at a time when they were seeking him. Acts 17:27 says that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way towards him and find him, yet he is actually not far from each one of us. Maybe God is revealing himself in the 300 prophecies that he fulfilled in the personhood of Jesus Christ when Jesus entered human history as God with us. Emmanuel. Maybe he's showing himself to us when he broke every barrier that might keep us from seeing God's character. When we struggle with divine hiddenness, Jesus is the living proof of God's desire to be found, that he stepped off of his throne to come humbly on earth and walk with his creation. That through Christ, we're reminded that God doesn't hide, he invites. Our hearts, however, may need the quiet humility and willingness to see beyond our narrow expectations. And my next point after this will really address this question of non-resistant non-believer.
Formally, then, Schellenberg's problem of divine hiddenness can be stated as follows. Premise 1. If there is a God, he is perfectly loving, something I'm pretty sure Jonathan agrees with. Premise 2. If a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant non-belief does not occur. Premise 3. Non-resistant non-belief does occur. 4. Therefore, no perfectly loving God exists. And the conclusion from the first premise is that therefore there is no God. A loving God, like the Christian God, would surely not refuse any willing person from developing a relationship with him. And so if somebody is truly non-resistant and open to receiving God's grace, we should expect them to receive it. Thus, Schellenberg's assertion that if God exists, then non-resistant non-belief does not exist. The question, then, is there such a thing as non-resistant non-belief, a non-resistant non-believer? To which all I can really say is nice to meet you. The last time I debated Jonathan a number of years ago, when I was just a few months out of being a teenager, I said that even if I found Christianity to be true, I still wouldn't want to worship the God that it promotes. I now, since then, have realized how irrational and self-defeating this assertion is, and stand before you today as an example of a non-resistant non-believer. I think it would be great if God existed.
I'm sorry, but I'm going to call bluff on this one. And I'm going to call, he is saying that so that he can prove a point. Because he realizes that admitting that even if there was enough evidence of God to say, I still wouldn't want to follow him, simply reduces his capacity to prove his point. And so when you ask, are non-resistant non-believers real? We would argue that no, they are not real. And especially if you can use an argument and on a debate, try and prove your point on the basis of someone's sincerity. You can't prove mathematics on the basis of someone's sincerity. You can't prove science on the basis of someone's sincerity. So in this philosophical argument, you cannot use sincerity as a basis of someone's truth, because then you can just say anything. Someone can say, well, I am sincere in following God, but I haven't found him, therefore there is no God. And Alex, quite frankly, just gave himself away again. So this idea of non-resistant non-believer, individuals who genuinely want to believe in God but find themselves unable to muster conviction, he's going to list out all of his personal experiences, from reading scripture to prayer to all of the apparent experiences of God, living with friends, studying theology, and to say that I knocked and no one answered. In fact, God is continuing to answer. He's surrounding him with Christians. He's surrounding him with real followers of Jesus Christ who are intellectuals, who have refuted every argument that he's laid out. And if you want to talk brilliant minds, let's talk Blaise Pascal, who was a mathematician and who said this: there is a God-shaped vacuum in the heart of each person which cannot be satisfied by any created thing, but only by God the Creator. Even those who feel they haven't encountered God may still sense a profound longing that nothing else can fill. And will end up filling that with everything else: money, sex, drugs, alcohol, indulgence, beauty, whatever you have and whatever you can get your hands on to try and fill that void. Have you ever searched for sunglasses when they were on your head? You look everywhere. You look under the couch, in the car, on your desk, only to realize they've been resting on your head the entire time. Now, here's a question. Could God be far closer than we think, only when we're looking in such specific ways or places that we miss him. It's interesting because throughout scripture and history, many people also failed to see God. Think about the Pharisees, the Sadducees, literally saw Jesus walking. They literally were in the presence of God. They saw him teaching, healing, casting out, and still they didn't recognize him as the Messiah, even though they couldn't find the body of Christ that he resurrected. And the truth is that unbelief can arise from various heart conditions, pride, cultural predispositions, or misunderstandings. Now, I'm not saying that every atheist is resisting God. I'm not even saying that maybe Alex is resisting God. He might not be resisting God in a sense. I'm just saying hypothetically, but it indicates that perhaps his capacity to overlook the obvious may be present when it doesn't match his specific expectations. It's almost like a relationship when you say, well, I will know that you love me when you do this. It's a manipulative tactic, actually. And in our relationship with God, we can't manipulate God. He will reveal to us how he wants to reveal himself to us. Now, will he manipulate us? Absolutely not. But he'll give us enough to know that he exists. There's still an element of faith, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't involve reason as well. Because Hebrews 11:6 tells us, without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. But if you come with the premise of, well, I'm going to seek God, but he's going to hide himself from me, there's nowhere in scripture that says that. And in fact, I know a lot of atheists and a lot of agnostics that have come to know Jesus, and they will tell you that they had a block. They will tell you that the reason why they had an intellectual block, a historical block, a scientific block, a theological block was not because God wasn't revealing himself to them, but because they didn't want to be found, because they wanted to remain in their lifestyle, just like what Alex said. Even if there was enough evidence for God, he wouldn't want to find and follow that God. God is a two-way relationship. And if you truly want to see him, he promises you will. Maybe not with a neon sign from the sky, but through his word, his people, and a genuine transformation of the heart.
I really do. I would absolutely love to escape death. I would relish being the recipient of unconditional love. Less selfishly, I would love to be able.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that, right? Because he already stated that before. Now, to recant from that and say, okay, well, actually now I actually do want to be a Christian. I'm sorry, but it's less plausible in a way, because what's more plausible is that you're saying that now, but you can weaponize that sincerity to prove and to try and prove your point. And again, like I said, you cannot just use sincerity as a foundation of an argument or to prove a fact.
To worship that which deserves to be worshipped. I just don't think it's true. Now, try as I might, look where I can, I find no response, no hint, nothing. I don't choose to disbelieve in God any more than I choose to disbelieve in aliens, despite how much I might want them to. So when faced with a psalm like Psalm 139, I'm overwhelmed with a sense not of beauty and consolation, but envy and disappointment. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? Where can I go, I should ask in response, to find it? Of course, you cannot know my heart. You can't know if I'm truly as non-resistant as I claim, but I hope that my actions here might betray me. As a Catholic child, I was once an altar boy. I would serve the altar of Mother Church every Sunday dressed in a white robe. In the time since then, I have, to put it mildly, been looking for God. I went to Catholic schools. I studied philosophy and theology at A-levels. I made a career out of engaging with religious arguments. I have explored arguments from contingency, from fine-tuning, from motion, from mathematics, from irreducible complexity and the alleged resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. It may surprise my followers online to learn that at university I visited numerous churches on the invitation of various friends. I spent hours talking with religious friends until the sun rose again, if you like. I attended Bible groups regularly too, which might surprise people as well. And in fact, I still do attend such groups. Just recently, I agreed to embark on a series of study of the wisdom literature, specifically reading it, again, in the hopes that this time I might finally feel a divine presence seeping from between the lines. I moved into a house for a year with 2 devoutly Christian housemates, with the express intention.
I also want to address this, that it's not about feeling. Following God is not about feeling, in the same manner that your relationships aren't based off of feeling, because there's going to be times when you don't feel like loving your brother or loving your sister or loving your friend. It's not based off of a feeling, because if you base truth off of a feeling, then your truth is going to change every single moment. So to go into something expecting a feeling, that's not what a relationship with God is. A relationship with God is faith. Now, like I said, it doesn't mean that faith won't accompany with it feelings of joy, feelings of fulfillment, feelings of love and adoration towards God. And it doesn't mean that when you have faith, you throw reason out the window, because we know that there are many brilliant minds in history that even were the founders of science, were the founders of philosophy. Even to this day, some of the most brilliant scientists, mathematicians, philosophers are Christian. Does that mean they left knowledge or reason out the window? Absolutely not. But it does mean that they aligned their lives with their Creator, and in that, they find ultimate purpose, joy, meaning, and fulfillment.
Of seeing if the obvious truth of Christianity and theism that people like to talk about can be found in the minutiae of daily life. I have looked, in other words, in a great deal of places. I read Athanasius and Anselm. I read Augustine and Aquinas. I looked in Julian of Norwich and Catherine of Siena. I looked at the sociological origin of religious belief in Durkheim and Marx and Freud and Jung. I looked at religious experience in William James and Rudolf Otto. I've looked in the modern works of people like Ed Feser and Bill Craig and Michael Murray and Richard Swinburne and Alvin Plantinga. I've looked in poetry. I've looked in the Psalms. I've looked in Job. I've looked in Ecclesiastes. I've looked in Dostoevsky. I read C.S. Lewis. I listened to worship music. I prayed. I studied the gospel. I even got an actual degree in theology from a university. And nothing, not once, not nearly, not ever, not even briefly have I experienced anything that speaks to the existence of a God in the universe. I think it's asking a lot of any atheist to seriously engage with a religion that he does not believe is true in any circumstances. But I feel like I have gone above and beyond what can be reasonably expected of any atheist who wishes to entertain the God hypothesis, and for my effort I have been awarded radio silence. The inescapable God of the NRSV, in other words, is for me the invisible God, or the inapproachable God, the deaf, distant God. The best account that I can give of this experience of complete and utter silence from deaf heaven is that...
You know, it's almost like saying, well, I spoke with atheists and I went to clubs and I sat down with my professor and studied biology and studied Darwinism and wanted to reject God, but God kept chasing me. You can take the exact same argument and you can make it personalized, you can flip it around, and it wouldn't work. There's no atheists that would say, oh, well, you can use that argument. You just so badly wanted to be an atheist, but God held on to me. God revealed himself to me. Therefore, there is a God. And you could also say, my personal testimony, I could say, I used to be a drug addict, and I used to be a drug dealer, and I used to be an alcoholic, and I used to be in toxic relationships, and I used to have to deal with anger management and all of these addictions and depression, and even felt suicidal and didn't find any meaning in life. And then I found God. Now, a lot of atheists will say, well, that doesn't mean anything. That's a personal experience. Well, Alex is really using this same persuasive tactic. This is my experience. And here's the thing, you can't discount that experience, because you can't discount the sincerity. And that's why you can't use that as a foundational grounding for this type of argument. So I would just dismiss this entirely, because you can pretty much shatter this entire argument by just saying, well, you could have done all those things so that you could find even more ways to refute Christianity. Because let's admit it, that's what his job is, refuting Christianity, questioning Christianity. That's what he gets paid to do. And so he has an incentive to learn about the enemy, so to speak, engage with the enemy, and then use it against him. I mean, that's what a smart general will do. Some of you are going to say, well, you're questioning his sincerity. Well, you have to question the sincerity if you're going to use that as a baseline, a key argument for the existence of God, because somebody else can use their sincerity in the opposite direction. So it just doesn't fly.
All that truly exists to me is impersonal space and air and rocks. I know, it sucks. I'm sorry. It's a shame, but there's no need to cry about it. And nothing more. My question to Jonathan then is simple. How can theism account for this lived experience? How can it account, in other words, for non-resistant non-belief? And if atheism, doesn't atheism offer a better explanation at the very least? Am I a non-resistant non-believer? If so, what offers a best account or a better account of such a condition? A universe in which there is a loving God who does want to be my friend, but is for some reason refusing or hiding or toying with me? Or a universe without one? Or is there no such thing as a non-resistant non-believer, which is the only remaining option? Do we all secretly resist in some way or other? After desperately,
Yes.
in other words, trying to convince myself of God's existence for years and being left painfully unconvinced, will you just submit, as if to add insult to this spiritual injury, that this is...
You know, he's appealing to the emotion of, oh, God hurt me and I'm in pain because he never revealed himself to me. You know, I'm going to question this because you created a YouTube channel dedicated to refuting God. Like, this is your life's work. This is your life's study. And so now to go around and say, well, it's because he never revealed himself to me, when God has sent you messenger after messenger after messenger after Christian apologist, I'm sure lovingly reaching out to you, trying to show you God does exist, taking every single argument that you have and breaking it apart, yet still to resist and to say, no, I'm painfully have this experience of having radio silence from God, when clearly, at least from a Christian perspective, God has been sending messenger after messenger after messenger.
in some way my fault? And if it is, then what could I have done differently? What should I be doing differently? What could I possibly have done differently given the course of my life? Now, assume for a moment, ladies and gentlemen, the alternative hypothesis of naturalism, of atheism, and ask if it provides a good account of non-resistant non-belief. And I think the answer is obvious. But it does get worse yet. You'll remember that my second fact that I said that I would bring up is the geographical predictability of religious belief. Not only does theism need to account for non-resistant non-belief, but also for the fact that such belief is unequally present across the globe. Stephen Mason has pointed out that the populace of Saudi Arabia is 95% Muslim and therefore 95% theistic, whereas the populace of Thailand is 95% Buddhist and therefore, at best, 5% theistic. How likely you are to be a theist, in other words, is intimately tied to the place in which you happen to be born. What can better explain this geographical spread? Theism or naturalism or atheism? Well, let's consider our two competing hypotheses. Could it be that God does exist, but that the Thai are simply naturally 20 times more likely to be resistant to belief in God than, say, the Saudis? Are they just naturally 20 times more stubborn or something? This seems implausible. This doesn't seem to be their fault. Okay, so maybe then it's not their fault, and God just has some reason to hide his face disproportionately more from the Thai than from Saudis, or indeed from those born here in Massachusetts, which has a theistic, according to one statistic, is 75% theistic. If theism is true, it seems to me that God has a lot to answer for here. Is it not troubling, Jonathan, for as a Christian, that your place of birth is a reliable statistical indicator of how likely you are to be saved? I'll say that again. Your place of birth...
Now, I want to talk about this because there's one thing Alex doesn't know about Saudi Arabia, is that there's a significant Christian community in Saudi Arabia. And I know this because I have my wife who found Jesus in Saudi Arabia. Imagine that. I have also an uncle. I have many friends who found Jesus in Saudi Arabia. Now, there's some statistics that show that the growth rate of the persecuted and underground church in Saudi Arabia is 65% higher than the global average. Now, you can talk about other countries that are Buddhist. Well, let's talk about China, because in China, it is considered the fastest growing church in the entire world, despite communism, despite suppression of freedom of speech. Now, to use the argument that God is just based off of geography, and with Alex highlighting the disparity in religious belief across different regions, on one country being overwhelmingly Christian, etc., we actually find that the countries that are overwhelmingly Buddhist or overwhelmingly Muslim or overwhelmingly atheist have actually found Jesus Christ. They've actually found hope in God. So does that mean God only hangs out in certain neighborhoods or certain countries? Absolutely not. And we can prove this statistically. So unfortunately, it seems, at least in this point, Alex did not do his due diligence, because I've seen him bring this up in multiple interviews and multiple debates. But statistically, actually, God didn't limit that to any particular country. In fact, if we go back to the early church, we know that the Christian church boomed rapidly despite being under severe persecution and despite being silenced and despite the predominant religion at that time not being Christianity. Yet it grew and it expanded.
Which is entirely arbitrary, is a reliable indicator of how likely you are on Christianity to be saved.
It's not.
You're significantly more likely to be a theist if you're born in Rwanda than if you're born in Thailand. Can this situation really obtain under the supervision of a God who wants to come to know us and makes his existence equally accessible to all? The chances seem infinitely small. Now consider naturalism or atheism. Religion varying by region is exactly what we would expect if it is a man-made cultural phenomenon, and nothing like what we should expect if there is, in fact, one true God who loves all equally. Again, I think atheism provides a much stronger account of this fact of our world. Finally, then,
unfortunately, it would if that fact was accurate. But everywhere that you find Christianity, you find that it does spread, even in the Middle East, where literally in some Islamic states, Christians would get beheaded and killed, and are continuing to get killed and martyred, yet they would do so. And I think one of the reasons is something that C.S. Lewis said: God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks to us in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. And when followers of Jesus Christ are suppressed and oppressed, we see that God shows up. He is near the brokenhearted. It's just a matter of tuning in. Imagine a radio station broadcasting classical music across the entire city. In one neighborhood, people love classical music and they tune in. In another part of town, they prefer hip hop or rock and roll, and they never switch the dial. Is the station not broadcasting to them, or are they simply not tuning in? You see, when people tune in and really search for God, God will reveal himself to them. There's even cases of Muslims who had dreams of Jesus, that Jesus would show up in a dream and reveal himself to them because they were sincerely seeking the true God, the one true God. As you see, from the beginning, God's heart was for all nations. The Great Commission commanded by Jesus in Matthew 28:19 told followers of Jesus Christ, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations." Now, the message of Jesus Christ will go through people because God uses you and I. And we see clearly that God intends for his message to transcend geographical or cultural boundaries, but he uses human vessels to do it. In fact, Christians believe that no tribe or tongue is excluded. Now, some cultures may be more open and may have freedom of speech or not, or maybe they've just had more exposure to the gospel, while some remain less exposed or oppressed for socio-political or historical reasons. Revelation 7:9 tells us, "After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb." See, Jesus Christ is not the property of any single culture. Whether it's a person in Saudi Arabia, Thailand, Massachusetts, or Rwanda, the same Jesus extends the same grace. Over centuries, missionaries, translators, and countless believers have spread the gospel precisely because they see that God calls them to every country, to cross every barrier. The problem isn't that God is limited to a certain coordinate on a map. It's that people see differently and in different places have had varying degrees of contact with the biblical narrative and Christian communities or missionaries. But the final hope in Revelation is that all nations gather before God. And that's a far cry from a local deity who plays favorites or naturalism that discounts a lot of the phenomena that we see in these non-Christian nations.
The third fact of our universe, which is gratuitous suffering. Gratuitous here means something like unjustified or unwarranted or meaningless. I do this because it's easy to see how some instances of suffering may be beneficial in certain circumstances or necessary to bring about some desirable state of affairs, some desirable end. But the existence of meaningless or unnecessary suffering does seem to be incompatible with the existence of a God who loves us and has the power to prevent it from happening. We're sometimes told that God has morally sufficient reason to allow suffering to exist. Indeed, if God is good, then he must have such sufficient reason. Perhaps suffering is necessitated by human free will. Perhaps suffering helps to develop a person's moral character, or maybe it's necessary to achieve some other end that God wishes to bring about. But intuitively, there appear to be instances of suffering that cannot serve any such end. And if even one example of these turns out to be an actual case of unnecessary or meaningless suffering, this would be enough to cause a problem. I want to propose something that might sound a little strange at first, which is that the biggest problem for theism here is not, famously, the great, intense sufferings of the world, like holocausts or earthquakes, but rather menial, less significant suffering, like being caught out in the rain, or stubbing your toe, or tripping over a curb on the street. Why? It seems a tad absurd, I'll grant you that, but consider this. When we experience a great suffering, like the death of a loved one, or a devastating earthquake, or indeed a holocaust, it's easy to imagine that this might somehow be part of a grand plan. The depth of our suffering may make us into better people. The people who die may be experiencing a much happier state of affairs in the afterlife now. Perhaps by allowing the Jewish Holocaust to take place, God makes it such that we are far less likely to allow even worse projects of genocide to occur in the future. But what could possibly be served? What possible end could be served? What possible meaning could there be in stubbing your toe, or tripping over a curb, or having a pigeon use your new suit as a restroom? Such instances are not significant. They're usually forgotten within a day or two, and therefore do not and cannot develop the soul. Nor do they seem plausibly part of some grand design or plan. They seem, that is to say, meaningless and unnecessary. More meaninglessness than instances of, let's say, great or intense suffering, much more meaningless than these. And truly meaningless, unnecessary suffering is certainly more expected in a world without benevolent supervision than in a theistic paradigm. A successful theodicy, in other words, then, needs to provide not only an account of the great and intense sufferings of the world, but also the menial sufferings which pervade the human experience. Now, I'm actually quite surprised that I've made it this far without mentioning animals yet. It's quite unlike me, but that's a final consideration that does deserve our attention. Whatever theodicy might explain human suffering, the existence of animal suffering seems infinitely more difficult to explain. Animals are not free in the way that we are, and so are immune to the free will defense. They cannot morally develop in the way that we can, and so are immune to soul-making theodicies. They are, on most accounts, not going to heaven, and so they will not be compensated for their suffering. Yet their suffering is immeasurably large. Somewhere, right now, billions of animals are suffering in the wild, from predation, from disease, from hunger, from fear. Imagine a deer with its leg caught under a fallen tree, dying of starved confusion. It doesn't know why it's there. It feels hungry, it's starving to death, and it's trapped under a tree, and it has no idea why. What could possibly be the purpose or meaning of this? I'll remind you that this is exactly the kind of thing that we should expect to see if the natural world is an amoral arena of accidentally existing organisms.
Yeah, I'm gonna attempt to really refute this. You know, the meaninglessness of suffering. Now, this is probably the most emotionally charged question any atheist or agnostic is going to bring up in any debate, because if God is both loving and all-powerful, why allow suffering that appears pointless? Stuff like stubbing your toe, or a deer dying horribly in a forest. Things like that. Maybe some people could argue that they don't build character, it doesn't highlight moral courage, and it seems downright gratuitous. But I'll quote John Stott here when he said, "I could never myself believe in God if it were not for the cross. in the real world of pain, how could one worship a God who was immune to it? You see, we serve a God that is not aloof from suffering, but he enters into suffering. Now, think about, for example, stubbing your toe. What could that possibly teach someone in that moment? Well, it could teach us that, oh, I'm cursing when I have a minor inconvenience and I get frustrated. It could teach us to have self-control. It could teach us in that moment to be careful of where we're going. Maybe in that moment you were thinking about someone that you hated, and now all of a sudden, boom, now that's brought to your attention. Oh, I shouldn't be thinking about hating that person. Or let's say stepping on a Lego brick, or let's say you got disconnected from Wi-Fi for 2 minutes and you're annoyed because now you don't have internet. What do these small frustrations ever train us for anything? And really it's about, you can find those little things, because just like a child would see that brushing my teeth is absolutely useless, to a parent, they know that, hey, this is adding something. This is protecting you. This is making sure that in the long run, you remain clean and you don't get cavities and you don't end up having to get a root canal. All those little things that from us, we can think that they're absolutely useless. You know, from a Christian worldview, we believe that God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts and his ways are higher than our ways. And we can see that and acknowledge that in suffering, it has purpose. It can test us. It can refine us. You see, to someone ignorant, they could look at the gold going through the fire and thinking, why do that to gold? To the connoisseur, they would know that this purifies the gold. This tests the gold. Romans 8:22 says, for we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. That yes, creation itself is subjected to decay, disorder, brokenness, due to sin's entrance in the world. And not all suffering is direct punishment or specific tests from God. Sometimes it's actually a product of living in the reality marred by the fall of mankind. That we live in a fallen world, so we will see and experience fallen things. But here's the beauty of that, my friend. Here's the good news of that, because John 16:33, Jesus says, in the world you will have tribulation. So the Christian worldview doesn't deny these things. Jesus says, in the world, you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world. You see, Jesus acknowledges trouble, but promises victory. And he says, all things will work together for the good of those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. You see, we believe that Jesus fully empathizes with suffering because he suffered as well. He was mocked, he was beaten, he was crucified. For what? For what you and I did. For our wrongdoing that needed justice, for our sins that needed a payment. Hebrews 4:15 calls him our priest who can sympathize with our weaknesses. This means that God is not indifferent to suffering. And though we might not see in that moment how that stub toe or that Wi-Fi or that hungry deer fits into the cosmic puzzle, the Christian conviction is that our present suffering are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed. Now, I'm going to get into the theodicies of animal suffering, because actually some do believe that animals have a soul and that they can go through some type of spiritual development or redemption, and that animals could be potentially resurrected. That doesn't say that in the Bible, or deified at the end times, and that would give suffering purpose and somehow a divine plan. And it's also possible that since we're image bearers of God, the whole purpose of creation is actually for us. It's for you. And that the evolutionary process which involves suffering could be part of God's good creation. That the natural world with pain and suffering is a mechanism for bringing about the kind of world God desires, which includes complex, diverse life forms capable of experiencing love, beauty, and relationships. Because love, beauty, and relationships don't exist unless there is hate, ugliness, and brokenness. You see, the sunset isn't so beautiful if it doesn't follow a dark, dark, gloomy night sky. And the light isn't so bright unless it's contrasted with the darkness. And that in God's providence and love, it's possible that God's love extends not just to human beings, but also to all creation, including animals. And that suffering might be a part of a larger narrative where God's love is ultimately shown through redemption or transformation. So it's possible that animals can also be redeemed and transformed in the end times.
Fighting with each other to stay alive. But can we really expect this on theism? Should we expect this on theism? What offers a better account? Keep in mind that, in other words, I'm not arguing that theism can offer no account of these kinds of situations and sufferings, though I am skeptical that it can. I'm only arguing that assuming that theism is false offers a better account of it than assuming that theism is true. Assume atheism, assume that human beings and other animals are nothing more than evolved creatures who developed pain receptors to make them more prone to avoiding the menial and great sufferings that upset our survival prospects. On this account, the existence of all suffering, small and great, is not only explained, but expected.
I mean, it's explained also from a Christian worldview. I'll quote G.K. Chesterton when he said, "When men choose not to believe in God, they do not thereafter believe in nothing. They then become capable of believing in anything." You see, when we close our doors to God, our worldview has to handle the full weight of life's mysteries, moral laws, beauty, meaning, fulfillment, consciousness, without any type of transcendent foundation. You know, when you look at a jigsaw puzzle, hundreds, maybe thousands of pieces, when you try to assemble it without looking at the cover image, it's not going to work, is it? Because the cover image shows the complete picture. You can force certain pieces together and you might guess a corner or two, but you're missing the guiding perspective. And so it is possible that many of us are trying to assemble the puzzle of life without looking at the cover, without looking at the big picture that God provides. And the Bible presents a God who made a world that's orderly, that's purposeful, but also that's fallen through human free will. And the big story of creation, the fall, redemption, and restoration is through Jesus Christ. You see, within that narrative framework, we see that life is meant to be good, but it is scarred by sin, by bad. And God's plan is to redeem and restore everything through Christ. Atheism and naturalism might appear simple, but it struggles to account for why we yearn for moral truth, meaning, and eternal significance. As King Solomon discovered, vanity of vanities, all is vanity, if there is no God who invests life with purpose. You see, John 1:3-4 says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men, and that the darkness would not overcome that light." There may be pain and suffering in your life, my friends, but there is a God that can overcome that. There may be darkness in your life, my friends, but there is a Christ and the light of the world that can overcome that. We see that Jesus is the source of both existence, and he is the missing piece that ties the puzzle together. You see, Jesus reveals the heart of God, that he is not an abstract theory, but a relational God who created us for fellowship with him. The Christian claim is that atheism can't quench our thirst for ultimate purpose, nor can it fulfill and address moral realities or inherent longings that we have for the transcendent. Now, if it's true that Alex is searching for God, the reason why he's searching for God is because God put that search inside him. And that through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, he shows us that God is personal, engaged, and has bridged the gap between heaven and earth. Yes, he enters our messy lives, and he alone can turn our mess into a message, our test into a testimony, and our pain to purpose. My question to you is, have you ever done wrong? Your answer is going to be yes. And my question to you is, should wrongdoing be punished? And logically, yes. And if you face a divine judge one day, do you want a pardon? I want one. God is just, and so wrongdoing must be paid. You have done wrongdoing. I have done wrongdoing. But you see, Jesus pays the price on the cross. He steps in as our divine defense attorney who offers the pardon if we place our trust in him. That's called the great exchange. He takes our penalty and we receive his righteousness. And no matter how hidden God might feel or how intense your doubts, the gospel stands firm. Jesus is real. He came to save, and his grace is available to anyone who will turn to him. And if you are carrying guilt, shame, fear, or a sense of cosmic loneliness, you don't have to carry that anymore. The door to a relationship with God has been thrown wide open. And so maybe you're in a place like Alex where you've read all the books and tried all the angles, considered that perhaps faith is less about nailing down every argument and more about encountering a person. That person is Jesus Christ. And he knows your doubts, he knows your struggles, and he knows your heartache. And he's ready to meet you where you are. Dear Heavenly Father, I pray for everyone reading this and everyone watching this and everybody listening right now, especially those who feel like they've knocked on the door of heaven and heard nothing in return. Would you reveal your presence, your peace, and your grace to them in a fresh, tangible, powerful way? Help us see that you are not distant or hidden, but that you entered our world through Jesus to draw us closer to you. And where there is skepticism, God, bring clarity. Where there is pain, God, bring comfort. Where there is hopelessness, bring the radiant hope of your resurrection power. May everybody watching, reading, listening find in you the loving friend, the just judge, and the gracious Redeemer we all desperately need. In Jesus' name, amen.